Hello, everyone. I'm Guy Podjarny, and I'm here to talk to you today about dev-first security, sort of a different view of how do we sort of approach security that tries to sort of focus more on the sort of modern development surrounding. I'm going to share my perspective, a little bit of like a market stance, as well as what is dev-first security. But maybe more importantly, I'll share a lot of specific practices from smart people that I've had the opportunity to talk to about how they tackle security inside their organization, so we can learn from them and we can share. So a little bit about me. I'm indeed Guy Podjarny, or Guy Pod on the sort of the Twitter spheres and the likes. I'm the co-founder and president here at Snyk. And before that, I was the CTO at Akamai after they acquired a company I founded called Blaze. During that stretch, I worked on web performance, very much kind of another aspect of sort of the world of DevOps. And then prior to that, I spent about a decade in AppSec. You can say before it was cool. Not sure if it's cool today. But definitely, kind of in its early days, building some of the first web app security products. I also, do a decent amount of this sort of type of public interactions. I host a podcast that I'll refer to a decent amount here, talking to sort of smart people and trying to give them a platform to share their security practices. And I've written a bunch of books with O'Reilly, including to that, there's links about you getting that you can get a free copy to them on the right around securing open source libraries and serverless security. So with that, let's dig into the talk itself. And I'm going to start with a word that not everybody likes, which is digital transformation. And it's it's a buzzword, and buzzwords can contain complexity, but it's also a very real thing. It's a change. It's a big kind of wave of evolution, revolution in how businesses approach the world of digital, and how we build software, how we run them, and how we just operate our businesses. There's a lot of ways to slice and dice digital transformation, and I'm going to use this split and say the digital transformation, at a very high level, is composed of three big buckets. One is more software. The second is cloud technologies, a different sort of foundation of technology on which applications run, which interact very closely with a different set of methodologies, which I'll refer to as DevOps methodologies. Fully appreciative that, again, there's a lot of ways to sort of look at digital transformation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dig into each one of these three in the context of security and see how they affect it. And so more software, simply put, equals more software risk. And I'm not going to belabor this point too much, but really, as businesses get digital, as more of your business, of your revenue, of your operation, goes online and goes digital, then really more of your risk, more of your data, more of your revenue risk, all of those become digital as well. This is a quote from James Kaplan, who heads the cybersecurity practice for McKinsey, and he was on the podcast, and he has this great blog post as well about how security is the linchpin, cybersecurity is the linchpin of digital transformation. But specifically, he points out quite simply to say, for many companies, cybersecurity is increasingly a critical business issue, not just a technology issue. And even points out, this reference to a CISO conversation that he had, that hedge funds didn't really used to care about cybersecurity, for instance, and now they're obsessed with it, just as one example of many. So not going to belabor this point too much, definitely not a technical point, but just to say, for many businesses, if you live in the technology world, this might be obvious that, sort of tech is at the center. But for many businesses, it's this shift of, what is the chief security officer focused on, from maybe more physical security or fraud or other aspects, to more and more being related to software risk. Getting a bit more technical, the second kind of aspect of cybersecurity is cloud. And cloud, there's a lot that you can say about the security of cloud. You can talk about how it's new technology, and every new technology introduces some risks. You can talk about how it's less mature and it's been embraced a bit more quickly, maybe, than its security kind of aspects have been researched, or just about the sort of the network perimeter change, going from data center to something that is hosted online. But what I think is more interesting is that cloud changes the scope of the application. Let's dig into what I mean by that. So in the pre-cloud era, again, using a little bit of black and white terms, in the pre-cloud era, you have this sort of heavy IT stack on which applications are built. there's some hardware management, maybe some colo, some data center, some VMs, so vSphere running. You've got some Cisco routers managing these kind of network access and what ports open, some VMs. an Oracle database sort of thing on site, and then you have some code and some libraries. And if the app teams want to engage with this sort of central IT stack, then they open tickets. You ask for some provisioning of some components, and you interact, and it's owned by teams that are relatively central, and they manage those components. In the cloud surrounding, the layers remain mostly the same. You still need to control network access. You still need to manage the OS. You still need a database. But suddenly, those might be a VPC on AWS. They might be a container that manages that AWS OS and needs to be patched. It might be a cloud database service that you are using, or maybe some MongoDB that you've sort of pulled in. And so the components are there, the functionality is still there, but the way that these things are pulled is very different. Now, instead of being managed by the central IT team, they're a part of the application. They get deployed and they are packaged up in the same area, in the same repository, through the same build pipeline as the code and the libraries of the application itself. And that's very significant, because it means where the decisions are made that impact these securities, and where the solutions need to be placed to help tackle security concerns with each of these layers is different. It needs to go from IT security to application security. And just to say that this trend will continue, like this motion of going into the app is more and more, and it's predicates on DevOps. We'll talk about that in a sec. But you can see data, you can see CDM, which I've sort of seen a lot in Akamai. The API gateways, or the use of third-party services, whether in the cloud or otherwise. All of these are becoming a part of the app. They're packaged up into one unit, one self-sufficient package that controls a lot of these different aspects and helps them run in this sort of uniform synchronization. And so for security, that's very important. We need to think about IT security solutions and the IT person, the central IT person needing to tackle them, to more AppSec-oriented solutions, and that need to be addressed as part of the developer workflow. And then last but very much not least is DevOps. And DevOps is it's a big thing. Again, you can define it in many ways, but it predicates a lot on these two core principles that are very related. One is continuous processes, continuous integration, continuous delivery, no slowdown, no manual delay, no stop for a manual process. And then the second is these empowered self-sufficient teams that can do all of that, they own that journey end to end, which very much relates to what I talked about with the cloud scope. So they also control the scaling of their system, the network access of their system, the data of their systems, etc. So they can tighten that loop, from writing a line of code to getting it to the market, to provide value, to learning from it, and back again, adapting to the market needs. And so with all of these changes, security, for the most part, hasn't kind of moved with the times. It's left behind. Security, traditionally, and still very much today, is done in this type of element, even if this is a circle and not an infinity loop, is done in a way that is about gating. It's about stopping. Stop here. I will do a security review. I will audit. And those are done by teams that are outside. And it's very, very much counter to the way all of these other activities are being done, to the motion, to the change that we're applying. And it creates a bunch of problems. First, security teams are in the critical path. So they're slowing things down. They're not continuous. And that implies they're going against the business motion, right? They are slowing things down, which just naturally conflicts with what everybody else is trying to do. Second, and related, is that the security teams are siloed. They're outside of where the core decisions are being made. So they always need to be chasing decisions that have been made. They don't have the right information. They're being worked around or not pulled in when they should be. And that results in just poor security, just insecure applications being shipped. And to make all of these things worse, security is understaffed. And it's understaffed not just because organizations are underinvesting in it, but rather because there's this big talent shortage. 50% of jobs remain unfilled. And so even if you were to sort of splurge and want to hire a very big security team, you can't. There's just not enough people for you to hire. And so there's this, it's a challenge. Security practices haven't changed nearly as much as these other aspects of our technology stack. So what I would propose, and again, show some examples of leaders and how they've applied it, is a different mindset to it. Think about security from a developer-first perspective. And what does this mean? When you say developer-first in the world of security, most people immediately say shift left. They think about shift left. And shift left is this notion, it comes from the waterfall mindset, right? It comes from the fact that there's a start and an end to the development process, and shifting left is earlier in the timeline, and it's a good thing. Like shift left is a good thing. You want to find issues earlier and address them before they become bigger. It's cheaper. It is more secure. But when you develop in a continuous fashion in this sort of infinity loop type model, where is left? It's not really left. It's about continuous. It's about that sort of constant attraction. You can say that developers have expanded to the right. So at the very least, it's expand left versus shift left. But really, if you're going to choose a direction, in my mind, that change is top to bottom. It's about changing ownership from being this sort of controlling entity that's more dictatorial and kind of tells everybody what to do, to more of a bottom-up approach with the relevant governance capabilities. And this requires changes on both sides. On the development side, it requires some empowerment by the organization of developers to have the ownership to tackle some of this security responsibility, and to equip those teams with the tooling, right, with the ability to actually tackle it well. And of course, the development teams need to step up and own this responsibility. On the security side, you need to shift that mindset and go from more of a controlling entity to more of a supportive entity, whose job isn't to find the problems, understand the problems, but rather to allow or help dev find the problems and understand the problems and act on the problems. And that their focus is more that governance and that tooling providers. So what we'll do now is we'll dig into each of these sort of empowered developers and supportive security teams and talk a little bit about some examples. It's not a comprehensive list of how can you achieve this? How can you help empower developers, and how can you help transform security to be more of a supportive security team? Let's start with empowered developers, and I'll try to weave in some examples from those specific leaders. So the first step to empower developers is to remember that you need to be building tools that look like the tools that they use, that are designed, that feel to them like developer tools, not like security tools that have been sort of shoved down their throats. And very much like a very big component of that is to allow self-serve usage that is successful. And there are very few security companies, you stop to think about it, very, very few security companies that offer self-serve solutions, let alone self-serve solutions for developers. And they assume a lot of knowledge, and they're just not designed for that. Security is a governance competency. It's oftentimes sort of something that's fairly broad across the organization. And so it's not where companies have invested. But for developers, that's very, very significant. They want to be able to start with something, try it out, see it work within their surroundings. And some security companies do this very well. HashiCorp Vault is a great example, has great onboarding, great self-serve capabilities. Auth0, which is very security affiliated, also does a great job with sort of great documentation that allows self-serve. You have to think whether you're building these types of tooling, whether you're a vendor providing these types of solutions to others, or whether you're building these tools for your internal consumption. You have to think about how do you enable developers within the org or within the ecosystem to self-serve, try that out. And it's really a predicate. It's hard to think of many successful developer tools that permeated the ecosystem that do not have a self-serve usage model. The second, that aspect that might feel obvious is to think about the problem from a developer's eyes and understand how a vulnerability made it in. When you look at security, generally solutions have been built for security auditors. So their view is that when you think about the big picture view, you think about consolidating the same security risk across many applications. For a developer, that's not the big picture view. The big picture view is my application and all its different facets. So I know that I pulled in these libraries. I know that I have these performance aspects. I know that it has these functionality aspects, and I want to know their security aspects within the context of my application, within the context of the actions that I've made that have all these implications, security being one of them. And so how you do this depends on the vulnerability itself or the security threat you're tackling. In the world of dependencies, one thing we found to be very helpful is this notion of the dependency tree. So in this example, I could say you use 5 libraries and these 2 are vulnerable, but it's much more productive for a developer if I say, well, you used 2 libraries, EJS Locals and Air Handler, and they pulled in these other libraries that are vulnerable. It makes it much easier to understand how does this relate to my app. Similar example is in code. I think this is maybe one of the ones that has been done a little bit better in the world of security, which is to show you in this line of code, this is the problem. This is a simple one, but oftentimes you also want to explain what is the sequence of data flow steps that you've seen that allow a malicious input to get to some vulnerable sync, and you want to show that vulnerability within the context of your code. Here, your code had this flaw over here. And when you think about the broader scope of the app, as we talked about for the cloud, the same concept applies to your code in the context of, say, containers. In containers, you should separate, for instance, for developers, it's a very big deal to separate the base image from what is inside the Docker file. It's very different. If a vulnerability is in the base image, you want to address it very differently. You would swap the base image. You wouldn't fix the point problem that has been outlined, versus if it's in the Docker file, that's kind of your code. That's the code that's written for your application. And then you want to be able, just like in that line of code, to point to that line of code and say, well, here's the run command inside your Docker file that introduces this problem. So think about problems from an application context, from a developer point of view. Another, a great practice that I've really loved in the same vein, comes from Segment. So Segment, they have a lot of really, really smart kind of AppSec practices. One of the things they do is they have this training where, they have a two-part training for every new developer. One of them is this thinking like an attacker. And in that practice, every example they use is one of a vulnerability that was actually previously in Segment, reported through a bug bounty or otherwise found. And what they found, as I highlight here, is that it's a lot easier to get developers to care, right? To relate to this vulnerability when it's a feature that you're familiar with, right? When it's a world where it's your context, it's your code. So I love this practice. It requires a bit more work, of course, but it just turns these vulnerabilities into great educational tools, and I highly recommend it. A third example, I'll talk about sort of 4 examples in this sort of empowered development side, is to remember that developers don't have the same level of security expertise as the security person. So you want to provide not just the answers, but also security questions. You want to guide the developer to say, this is what's important from a security perspective for you to even probe, for you to ask that question. And I'll give a couple of examples here. One is PagerDuty. So PagerDuty can be used for incident response as a whole, and specifically for security incidents as well. It has good capabilities. And they did this great job writing down what is a security incident and what are the steps that you should do. And clearly this is a template, and it can and should be customized for different organizations. But I love the hand holding, is to say, this is what is a security incident. These are the questions that you need to do. This is the sequence of steps that you should do. You should cut the attack vector, cut off the attack vector. That's the most important thing. You can't expect developers, you can expect developers to take responsibility to note it, to act on it, but you can't expect them to become security experts. The tooling has to embody that type of expertise. In our world, in the world of Snyk, we see this a lot around properties of vulnerabilities. There are a lot of vulnerabilities. Unfortunately, use a lot of open source, and these are pieces of software. They have bugs, including security bugs, known as vulnerabilities. And so when you have too many of them, how do you help developers deal with that faster? And examples of that are sort of saying, for instance, is there an exploit in the wild? And what should you ask about that exploit? Is it binary? Well, no, there's a maturity element. So we say, okay, there is an exploit in the wild for this vulnerability, and it is mature. So you should act on it with more urgency. Or when you talk about a component, help understand, where is the vulnerability? Above and beyond what is the vulnerability, which all tools do. It's like, this is a cross-site scripting, this is an SQL injection. Tell me where in the functionality of this component is the vulnerability, and that makes it much easier to understand it, to relate it to my application. So all of those are just, think about the security expertise you want to embed. And then the last bit I have as an example here is remediation. And a simple statement is, a developer's job isn't to find issues, it's to fix them. And arguably an auditor's job, while they should care about fixing, is to find the issues, and then they pass it on to development to fix it. They can't fix it themselves. And so as a developer, you have, like, if you're trying to get security solutions that developers will embrace, you have to think about their full journey. You have to think about, how do you get them all the way to remediation? And there are a lot of examples for it. I think in Snyk we're fairly well known around this sort of open fix PR, try to kind of help. I told you about a problem. I'll also package it up into a pull request and tell you can fix it. And now a bunch of other tools are mimicking this functionality, which I can help simplify this. You see that sort of merge advice around telling you whether it's likely that this would break it or not. That's all about making this upgrade would break your application or not. It's all about making it easy for you to upgrade. Another cool example I've seen recently, sometimes you can't auto-fix it, but still help support to that fix examples. This is an example from a tool called Dipcode, which is not actually security focused, but when they talk about a problem, they show examples of how it's been fixed in other repositories. So that's pretty cool as well. It's all about helping your remediation journey. And this is a great example internally when you think about that remediation, which is, Twilio has, like many organizations, they maintain centrally these internal golden base images for containers. But they've seen that developers, they need help knowing when to pull them in and pulling in the new versions of those golden images when they get released. And so what they've done is they've created an automated tool that creates pull requests to update those from statements in the Docker. And they've seen that despite the fact that they haven't done any internal promotions, because this is quite recent and the COVID-19 change drew attention, around 2/3 of these PRs have been acted on. And so, I love Yash Kosaraja, like he heads product security over there, and I loved his comment. Says, you make the task as simple as possible, they do the right thing. You really simplify that remediation. So this is one side of the fence, right? It's about empowering developers. There's much more you can do around it, but just think like a developer, think about what you would want. On the other side, from a security team, we need to think about how do we need to adapt the security practices. And so the first and big change is aligning the organization to it. Security organizations have generally been aligned to IT orgs for the most part, because that was the group that was addressing security. So you want to think about how do you want to adapt it to the development and the DevOps organizations. I have this sort of simple diagram here where you have dev is aligned to DevOps on one side and to AppSec on the other side. And then you have cloud security. Where does that fit? Some of it is aligned to DevOps, some of it is aligned to AppSec in its nature of its activities, some is its own thing. So you want to think about this a little bit more. I would say that this type of change comes in 3 core levels. There's an organizational change, literally who does the CISO report to, how do people align, how do we interact across the business. There's a skill set change, what do you need, what are the competencies that you need in members of the security team dealing with this problem. And mindset change, that's again, that sort of controlling entity into a supportive entity. That's a big deal. Let me show 3 examples from different companies on these 3 items. So organizational change, a great example is what Envision does. So Envision, and this was from a conversation with Sarah Dunnock, who's an AppSec person over there, is that they have an AppSec person that is aligned to a preset list of development teams. And I think at this point their ratio is about 1 to 10. I'm not entirely sure, but what that allows them to do is that it gives the AppSec person an ability to learn the domain of those specific applications, to participate in the stand-ups, to create that bond, and it gives the dev teams a very clear person to talk to build that relationship and to go to when they have a security question or a security need. So I love that pairing. It's basically mimicking what finance and HR have been doing for a good while. So that's a good example. And by the way, like for each of these examples, there's a whole bunch of other companies that I've spoken to that repeat these practices. I'm just sort of showing you one example, one anecdote. The second thing is about skill set. And actually, before I talk about Justin's comment here, even Yash, that I've just mentioned before from Twilio, talks about how he likes within his team everybody to at least be able to empathize to development, and so needs to be able to code a little bit. So that was one example. Pretty much every security leader today hiring highlights that importance. And Justin Soumeni, who's a very experienced chief security officer across many companies, he expects this to be a big shift in the skill set within the world of security. He says, I would say security team staff will rotate about 1/3, maybe half, from more of a process management mindset that is being done today, generally into developers. And he points out that, what does that do to the security workforce? That's a big rocking, into it. Do you need to lay off people and hire different people? Roland Cloutier, who was a CISO of TikTok today, he was at ADP when I spoke to him. At ADP, he did this big training exercise. He invested, he put a plan in place to reskill or up-level in the relevant skills his security organization, and has done a very good job kind of retaining and growing that talent. But you should note, as Justin says, that this is a big thing. This is a big impact that will take years to shift and evolve into. So you have to think about the skills that you need in that team. And then last but not least, the mindset change. And I love Kelly Shortridge is just brilliant. She's a security analyst, and she's a VP product and strategy at Capital 8. And she talks a lot about DevOps and security. And one of her comments is that the way she likes to refer to the relationship between DevOps and security today is that they're frenemies, and I love that term. But really, that inevitably these two groups are going to need to partner together, and ideally, this isn't an antagonistic relationship. So it's a mindset change that goes from I'm telling you what to do to I'm collaborating with you to get that done. So those were big changes that are at the core. Two core practices. One, paved road. So making security easy using the paved road is a concept that I think came from Netflix. These are two presentations explaining what is the paved road, which is not just a security concept, coming from Diane Marsh's presentation from Netflix. And I'll just kind of quote her because I think she defines this pretty well. It says, first, the paved road is a concept formalizing the set of expectations and commitments between the centralized teams and our engineering customers. When we talk about from security, what does it mean to be secure? What are the practices that you actually should be doing to get security done right? And the second is technology that makes that specific set of activities easy in a specific surrounding. So it's a well-integrated, supported machinery to enable engineers to focus on delivering the core business value and to socialize the centralized team support. So basically, it's a specific path where there's a platform that already does a bunch of the things that you need to do very easily, very well for you. So it makes it easy for you to stay on that route. And so this approach is good for a lot of other sort of DevOps technologies, and it wasn't created for security. But I had a chance to talk to Jason Chan, who's the VP InfoSec there at Netflix, and they use that same concept for security as well, right? So he says we call that a paved road, and I loved his terms, as you can certainly bushwhack and make your way through the woods, but if you have this sort of nice smooth paved road that gets you to the destination, you're likely to opt in there. So it's about making it easy to make the right decision. And they do have that freedom of responsibility. And so if an individual decides, if a team decides to go bushwhacking and kind of go off-road, then they become responsible for the concepts that are part of that paved road of what does it mean to be secure. So paved road, I think, is a very powerful way to empower teams, but still try to coalesce them towards the right path. And then last and very much not least, as a concrete practice that I'll mention, is this celebrating security success. And it's amazing how often it comes up in these successful security leaders. I'll use this example for Zach Powers at One Medical. And he says, he refers to his experience at Salesforce as well. And I'll just kind of read it out a little bit, so I think that's great. At Salesforce, we definitely tried a range of positive incentives, which he's carried on to One Medical. It says, somewhat as simple as high-fiving somebody for doing the right thing, a little bit hard in the sort of Corona surrounding, but still, like this notion of just acknowledging that somebody did something well already goes a long way. And part of it is just like small incentives, small bragging rights. And we had this whole conversation about how everybody loves swag and around hoodie-driven security, and they actually invest a fair bit at keeping it fresh around those. But what he points out is that if you empower software engineers, and you kind of ask them to and expect them to sort of make decisions, then recognizing them for their good decisions and good work is very, very important and produces great results, far more than the stick approach. This came up in a lot of different conversations I've had on the podcast, but one that really kind of I grew especially fond of is from a duo that's now part of Cisco, and Mike Hanley, who's the head of security there, talked about how they automated a little recognition bot. So they have this friendly neighborhood security bot, I love that term, that goes off and reaches out to the people and just sort of thanks them for making good security decisions. So it could be that they updated their phone to the latest release and done that as one of the first few people, and they just acknowledge it. It could be just a thank you. It could be spot bonuses to people, just raising their hand and saying, hey, there's a security issue here. So when people do the right thing, just investing in it and actually building it. Just for the absence of doubt, I quote a lot of smart people here. I do provide value as well when we're in those podcasts. For instance, in this conversation with Mike, he went on to talk about how, even little things get rewarded, and that they have a set of these stickers, special kind of edition of sticker that says they were the first to report a phishing attack or something that they give. And I contributed a lot of value saying that's awesome. I think any good rewarding system should definitely involve stickers. So it's a lot of wisdom in those words. So to wrap up, digital transformation is happening, right? And whether you like the buzzword or not, the change is very real. And security practices haven't evolved anywhere near as fast. So we need to do something about that. And what I would propose here is that we need to transform security to be dev first, to think about how that development teams need to be making decisions. We expect them to be making decisions and to be autonomous, and that everything should revolve around that. It should start from that point, and then we figure out how do we achieve it. And I'd like to leave you with one more quote from a very smart person, that I had a chance to have on the podcast, and that's Adrian Ludwig, who's the Atlassian CISO. And he has this very broad kind of big picture, and I'll read out his quote, which I liked. He said that when he worked at Google, he got the call from them, and they talked about Android is coming up strong, and they need to figure out security, and that was a seminal moment for him because it was clear that mobile was an opportunity to rethink, reset how we go about security. And when you think about how good mobile security is compared to desktop security, the Windows ecosystem, and the likes, it's night and day. It's much, much, much better. And he points out that the shift to cloud is a similar fundamental shift for companies. So it's a chance for us to rethink what is possible. So I love that. It's an opportunity for us to think about something that is different. And again, I would posit that a start for that is this dev for security approach focused on empowered developers and a supportive security team that aligns to this sort of digital transformation landscape. That's it for me. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very, very much, Guy. And in fact, we have the man himself here. Hey, Guy, how's it going?
Doing well. How are you?
Yeah, doing very, very well. And I'm glad that you've set up your room exactly as in the video, to even with the detail of hanging something on the door.
Look, it's about the cognitive dissonance, really, of sort of the discomfort of the.
I can guarantee everyone, having worked with Guy as well, this isn't just a Zoom background. This is your workspace.
It is what it is, It's
you happen to have that hung up exactly as it was in the video and everything. So, thank you, Guy, for a great session. People in chat very really like the idea of that empowerment rather than that kind of shift left, and people recognize it's obviously more than just a shift left. I'd love to ask a question actually in terms of this empowerment. You showed that image where the dev more and more is looking like it's actually being wrapped up into the application, and less is kind of on that more traditional ops side. How does that obviously we have that balance of 100 devs to 10 ops to 1 security, which we're all very familiar with. What kind of impact does that have on that ratio? Does it exacerbate that even further if more is being pushed to empower the developers? What do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think there's kind of 2 flavors to it. One is the ratio itself. So like the ratio today is unhealthy. It's too many. So I don't anticipate a lower ratio. Maybe a little bit, like when you look at indeed companies like Envision and others that are already kind of employing. Shut this down a bit. Already employing this type of pairing, they tend to still be in that sort of 50-to-1 ratio, 40-to-1 ratio. So I don't anticipate fewer security people would be needed. Just maybe we can actually cope with the load with them. On the developer side, it does imply that it's just that ratio alone just demonstrates to you how you can't just expect developers to just go off and do what the security people did as well. It's I guess that the ratio doesn't necessarily help that because you were outnumbered before, but it's still it's not something that's realistic, and it's also going to take them more effort. So you have to think, as you sort of shift some of that responsibility or the activities, you do have to have that come not just with a responsibility, but also with tools, also with help to sort of say, how do you actually get that done? And the other thing I would say is that some things are actually easier for a developer to do than a security. Like the same security task might be easier for a developer because the developer actually understands the application much better. So evaluating, for instance, a vulnerability, once you've acknowledged it is a vulnerability, how does it fit into the application is all but trivial for the developer. And it's typically very hard for a security person who needs to manage interaction with many different teams and doesn't live and breathe the specific app. So yeah, all in all, the security ratios won't change much, but their activity will.
Right. Cool. 2 more questions that have just come in. First one from David Scribonia. Guy touched a little on how to think about dev-first security from a product perspective, and I'd like to dive deeper into that. Specifically, what are the top 3 things to consider when building a dev-first security product, and what are the top 3 pitfalls and mistakes?
Yeah, I think it's always hard to kind of hone it down to sort of top 3. But first of all, I would say that when you're building an internal product, you're building a product just the same as when you're building an external one. Like, it's a bit more of a captive audience, but hopefully you're aspiring to the same level of success. So what was it? The top 3. What was again the sort of the?
So the last one was the top 3 pitfalls or mistakes, and top 3 things to consider when building a dev.
Yeah.
Oh, we've got a couple more questions, so let's just go to the top 1. The top one when building a dev first.
I'd say that the top pitfall is to think that you can take an auditor product and you can just integrate it into the workflow of the developer, and that would make it a developer product. So that's probably the primary pitfall. There's a lot of offshoots from it, but actually put yourself in a developer's shoes and think, what is it that the developer would need to be successful in the day-to-day, and actually, go talk to the developer, the audacity here, and sort of get that input. And then I guess kind of related is the top thing to consider is ease of use, probably kind of coming back to the fact that developers are expected to do a lot, so really fundamentally, you want to raise it, you want to get them to care, the product has to be sort of, elegant and, very secure. But if it's not easy, it's not going to be used. So it has to be very straightforward for a developer use case to use the product.
Awesome. We have a few more questions in here, so I'll encourage you to jump into the Bella app later and answer some of these. One I want to finish on because this is a really interesting one. Brad says, thanks for the great session. What's the metrics for efficiency you suggest as best to measure dev empowerment? Yeah,
it's really like metrics and security. Metrics is always hard. Metrics in engineering is hard. Metric in security, measuring risk, is super hard. I'd give a few guidance. I don't have like a magic number to give, but I'd say when you look at security, you should look. Breaches are not a good feedback loop, but you should separate your backlog from your addition of vulnerabilities from response. So those are the 3 bits. So I'll start from the last. Response is like you can set SLAs to how quickly do you respond when an issue comes and reported to you. That's a process question. It can be optimized, and it includes how quickly can you make a decision. Do you have the right information at the time? Even when you chose not to address it, that's still like an SLA element. So that's one. The second is this notion of not getting worse. Can you stop the bleeding, right? So try to measure how many issues, since you started, as though you had no issues at the moment, how many new issues get introduced that you find out about after, and maybe even how quickly do you find. So try to sort of figure out for new issues, forget the backlog, for new issues, how are you doing? That's probably the fastest, that's the measure you want to focus on first, right? Like that's not the leaky bucket, right? Otherwise, like you keep trying to address the backlog, but you're creating more and more faster. And then last is really around that backlog, where really it's about the strategy for addressing the rate of the issues, the methodology. It's more about a constant kind of model of constantly improving, constantly fixing things. All of those are overlaid, of course, on a risk posture. Like you always have to think about when you do address an issue, are you addressing the most important issues? So that's hopefully that kind of gives you a place to start. Measuring is hard, especially in security.
Wonderful, guys. Thank you very much for the session. And like I said, if you're able to spend some time in Umbrella, there's a bunch on the main stage, about 3 or 4 more questions. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference and day.